everyone. I'm Lauren Henkin. I'm the founder of the Humane Space. If you don't know anything about us, our mission is to encourage a daily practice of awe and wonder. If you're not currently signed up on our email list, where you'll find out about great events like this, please do so at www.thehumane.space. If you missed our previous conversation with Professor Joshua Hicks, that is on our YouTube channel. This will also be posted on YouTube, which is at the Humane Space. We're going to cover a lot of topics tonight, including how emotions impact well-being, awe, and more. Our guest is Dr. Virginia Sturm, an associate professor in the departments of neurology and psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Sturm is also the director of the Clinical Affective Neuroscience Laboratory. After undergraduate work at Georgetown University, she received her PhD in clinical psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, and completed her clinical internship and postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, San Francisco in neuropsychology. Her research focuses on identifying the neural systems that support emotion and social behavior in neurodegenerative disease and neurodevelopmental disorders. As I've said in previous talks, we like these to be as conversational as possible. So we will try and limit our conversation to about 25 to 30 minutes, and then leave another 30 minutes or so for you to engage directly with Dr. Sturm. You can do this in a few ways. You can use the raise hand button on the bottom of your screen, at which point you will actually come on to the video with us. Or you can feel free to post questions in the chat. I will read those off. There's also a live transcript button on the bottom of your screen, which will provide captions, live captions as well. And we're not just here to have you listen to us. We want this to be an open conversation, an opportunity to ask questions, to engage and learn. And I encourage you to participate as much as you feel comfortable doing. So welcome to Dr. Sturm. We're so grateful to have you here tonight with us. I just wanted to start by talking about your work. In general, much of your work is focused on the neurology of emotions, including how emotions are impacted by disease. So I thought maybe we could just start by having you talk a little bit broadly about your work. Why do you study emotions?
Yeah, thanks for that first question. My work focuses primarily on people with neurodegenerative diseases. And what I mean by that is they're progressive neurological disorders that affect the brain. And certain diseases affect behavior and emotions more than others. And so we can study these diseases, such as Alzheimer's disease and another disease called frontotemporal dementia that we study a lot, or FTD, in order to understand the brain systems that support emotions and that go awry when people have symptoms of emotions. And the reason this is important is not just for understanding these neurological disorders, but the same systems in the brain produce emotions in all of us. And so by understanding how emotions kind of go awry in certain neurological conditions, we can also understand how they might function differently in people with a variety of psychiatric symptoms, such as anxiety or depression. And so, across psychology and psychiatry, emotions are really at the heart of a lot of mental health difficulties. And that's really the motivation of the work broadly, is to understand the biology of emotion and their roles in mental health symptoms.
And, as I was putting together some questions to discuss with you, I realized, like, this may seem so basic, and it's not something that I think about very often, but what is emotion, how do you even define like what emotion is?
Yeah, it's actually a really hard question and a controversial question, to be honest. There's a lot of different opinions in the field about what an emotion is and how to define it and how to measure it. So I can offer how I think about it, but it's not, how everyone thinks about it. So we think that emotions are brief states that kind of are usually rapid and even automatic, and they kind of organize the body and the brain to respond to something important in the environment. And each emotion serves a function. So every emotion, exists for a different reason. So certain emotions such as disgust, help us to kind of move away from a contaminated or potentially contaminated object, or, we scrunch up our face and kind of push our tongue forward, and all of that when we feel disgusted, and that's all to move away from, potential harm. And so that kind of emotion is really critical for our survival. There's other kinds of emotions like positive emotions, which we'll talk more about, but positive emotions are really important for helping us to connect with other people, to have long-term relationships, to feel bonded with others. And so, we can define emotions in this way, and then we can measure them in various, with various approaches. So if you consider an emotion to have all these different responses, so your face changes in a certain way when you feel an emotion, your body changes in a certain way, like your heart rate changes, your breathing changes, you might have sweat on your hands in certain emotions. We can quantify all those different kinds of changes in our studies. And so that's how we go about kind of eliciting emotions and measuring them based on the definition that we're using. And so if you define it in a slightly different way, so some people focus more on like how I describe my emotions with my words, you might measure it in a different way where that's more language based. Whereas if I focus more on the bodily, reactions during emotions, then I might measure those components kind of more specifically.
And so I know a lot of your work addresses awe. How do you define what awe is?
Yeah, so awe is one kind of positive emotion. So we think of emotions as families of states, and so within the positive emotion family, awe is one of those states. And awe is a positive emotion that we feel when we are in the presence of something vast. This can be something perceptually vast, it can be physically vast in size, it can be big. But it also can be vast in terms of like social scale, like how someone's behaving in this amazing way or something they've achieved. And so often when we feel awe, it's in response to things like art or religion or nature. And it's important to keep in mind that, when you go to somewhere like, the Grand Canyon or something physically very large, you might feel awe, but you can also feel awe in response to very small things like a ladybug or something, or the petals of a flower, because still perceptually it's kind of a grand pattern in nature to appreciate. And the other key part about awe is that it forces us to do what we call accommodation, which means that we have to kind of readjust how we understand the world to take in this new information. So, when we feel awe, we have to, re-understand kind of what we thought the world was like to take in that new piece of information. Therefore, it has like a physiological effect in the body. It's very calming, and you might breathe more slowly, your heart rate might slow down, but you also might have changes in your thinking where you might be more curious or more open-minded, or a little less needing to, make a decision about something. And so it shifts kind of how we think and also how we behave and feel.
Does it mostly occur in new experiences?
It's easier to feel awe in new places, but it doesn't have to be in new places. I think it's definitely easier, but if you focus on something that you hadn't focused on, even in a very familiar situation. I've told this story to others of my husband during the lockdown of COVID. We're in our house all the time, like very, more hours than we usually are. And he started noticing this hummingbird outside in the yard, and every day he'd give me some update on the hummingbirds' activities. And this was just our house, like it was our yard, nothing, nothing had changed, but he had noticed some new details within the yard and found awe in those in the everyday. So yeah, I think it's partly just the mindset of like shifting outward, attending to the details of the world around you and appreciating them in new ways. I can find awe thinking about how I'm speaking to you through my computer right now. Like, how is that possible? I don't really understand it. So it doesn't have to be necessarily a new place, but some people are more experience awe more easily than others. And so if awe is a little harder for you to experience, you maybe something newer or different would facilitate it more.
What do you think, what are the benefits of awe? I guess physically and for well-being?
Yeah, there are really numerous benefits of awe. So physically, I mentioned that when we feel awe and other positive emotions, we have this, they feel pleasant, first of all. So there's this subjective quality that feels good about positive emotions. But within the body, they have this kind of calming inner state associated with them. And again, breathing and heart rate might slow during the experience of awe. There's some studies showing people have lower inflammatory levels in their bodies and who are more prone to awe. And kind of psychologically, when we feel awe, we feel more connected to the world and we feel more connected to others. Also, if you help people to feel awe, they are more humble, they are more generous, they are more kind and giving to others. So just shifting that attention away from the self and onto others, as happens in awe, people kind of act in ways that are a little less self-focused and more other-focused. And that's a really important reason that awe is an important social kind of emotion.
Is that when you talk about kind of the smallness, is that related to kind of what you mean by the small self, or is that related to what you're talking about?
Yeah, so sometimes people describe awe as promoting the small self, and sometimes people ask like, oh, that sounds bad to have a small self, but it's not to demean the importance of yourself. Everyone's experiences are important and meaningful, but I think it does help to put things in perspective. So when people feel awe, like there's been a number of manipulations of this, but they write their name smaller if you ask them to write their name after feeling awe, or they we have some data that I'll talk about from our study where they filled less of a photograph with their own image than people who didn't feel awe. So literally people feel smaller and yet more connected to others. And again, that's why this shift away from myself and onto the world around me is thought to promote these what we call pro-social kinds of actions that are focused more on other people than me, because I realize I'm just this one small thing in this very connected world, and I should, help others more than just worry about my own problems. So that's kind of how the small self, like why it's a helpful kind of framework, I think.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, those connections between, I think there was one study I read about people who were more prone to awe are more prone to donate time, like to a charity or to, volunteer their time. And that's fascinating. I also want to just get back a little bit to talking about emotions. And one thing I was really curious about was, how do you think our emotions evolve over time? Like, do you think, for example, that our understanding of guilt or pride changes as we age? And I actually don't know if you've researched this. I'm just asking for your opinion on it.
Yeah, so guilt and pride are examples of self-conscious emotions. So I didn't mention self-conscious emotions before, but self-conscious emotions are kind of another family of emotions, and they are a little more complicated than negative and positive emotions, because They require an appreciation of oneself in a social context. So you can't have a self-conscious emotion unless you have a real or imagined other in your mind, so you can't feel guilt unless you picture whoever it is judging you for whatever you did wrong. Same with embarrassment, you commit a faux pas or you commit some kind of social transgression that is in front of someone else, or you're imagining in front of someone else. So these evolve, these develop in kids later than not basic, but negative and positive emotions, such as, infants will cry, for example, very, from the first minutes of after birth, but the self-conscious emotions take a little while longer to develop, not till about the second half of the second year of life, so 18 months or so. And so that's just the very beginnings of it, when infants begin to recognize themselves in a mirror and have these basic elements of self-awareness. So your question has to do with a little bit more of my knowledge of, or my judgment or knowledge of my emotions. So it's kind of a meta level of emotion. So yeah, I think that's a complicated thing to assess, but there are ways that people can assess that kind of thing by usually with language, honestly, like how you describe your emotions or how you would describe how you felt in a situation and where you felt guilt, for example. So some people use like very detailed, specific emotion words to describe their feelings. And some people are very like, I feel bad, and don't go into a lot of details. And so to me, that's probably a good proxy for how people kind of, interpret or appraise their own kind of internal states. And that has to do with, yes, learned information about emotions and context and whatever you've learned is good or bad about the emotion. And all of that is very culturally, based of how we understand our feelings and what we think is right or wrong, good or bad. So it gets very complicated.
One of the talks that I watched of yours talked about how the brain actually develops emotional responses, and I believe you talked about the appraisal process, and I was wondering if you could just explain that process.
Sure. So we think of emotions as processes that unfold over time. So even if an emotion happens really quickly, there are several steps that kind of happen within that, even a few seconds. So appraisal usually refers to some kind of input into the system. I have to see something scary, hear something scary, smell something scary, and that's the appraisal. So it's like the perceptual part of the emotion generation system. After appraisal, then the emotion begins to unfold. So there's thought to be this initial kind of reverberation of the emotion where it starts, you might feel your heart, jump a few beats or a beat, and your face might, move in a kind of unpredictable, unwanted way. But then the emotion unfolds and can either kind of progress and you can show fear, for example, or you can regulate your emotions. And so emotion regulation has to do with the fact that we all luckily, can control and manage our emotions to some extent, some more than others. And there's lots of different ways that people can do that. And humans obviously are very good at regulating and managing what we show to others in that last kind of part of the loop. And then the little bursts of emotion can keep going and keep unfolding. So it doesn't happen just in one little burst, but then it comes and goes and you have another thought and then, the emotion goes up or it goes down, or you can change it, or so it's like a dynamic process kind of over time.
And talking about some of those triggers, like you hear something or you smell something, if some of those triggers get dulled as we age, are we capable of the same kind of emotional response if the triggers are dulled? Like, does our brain compensate in some way if those mechanisms for taking in those triggers are dulled in any way?
You mean like if you can't hear well or you can't see well, like that?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's a hard question. I think if there's any, so we think of emotions as kind of multimodal. So like if there's any way for the input to come in, say I can't see well, but I can hear okay,
Right.
you know what I mean? And something scary is happening. If any input is coming into the system, I could still generate the emotion if the part of my brain that produces the emotions is still healthy and working well. And so, and even if I can't hear or see well, I can still remember things, right? I could still think about a time that was frightening or sad. And again, if the part of the brain that produces emotions is working well, I could still sit here and, create an emotion for myself
Cry.
from my mind,
Yeah.
right? And so I think it's kind of different parts of the system, like the input system. Yes, it would be affected if my perception is off, but that doesn't mean that you still couldn't feel emotions from other roots.
I think this is one of your quotes. Emotions offer a critical window into mental health and can be modified with simple strategies to improve well-being and reduce dementia risk. What is the connection between emotions and dementia?
Yeah, I mean, this was really kind of work inspired by my work with the Global Brain Health Institute. And I encourage everyone to check it out because it's this very unique interdisciplinary fellowship program where we train people from all sorts of backgrounds on brain health and promoting brain health, very broadly construed, and it bridges art and science together. So it's this very unique program. But in that program, we think a lot about kind of scalable ways that we can all improve brain health around the world. And one way that, one thing that's good for the brain is positive emotions in general and not having sustained negative emotions. So as I mentioned, emotions are brief. So negative emotions are important too. I don't mean to say we shouldn't have negative emotions. You should feel your negative emotions. They are telling you something important. But we don't want them to be sustained forever. Like you don't want to feel angry for years of your life. That's not good for your health. So we want to have our negative emotions and then return back to our homeostasis where we feel calm and quiet on the inside. And so there are lots of things that can be associated with sustained negative emotions. So things like depression, longstanding kind of anxiety, loneliness, pain, these are things that are chronic negative states that do have effects on the physical body as well as on the mental health. And so that was how we started thinking about using positive emotions as kind of an intervention. That's a relatively accessible way to change mental health, even in midlife or early life. And we now know that mental health in early and midlife influences how we age and how our brains age and influences our risk of dementia in later life. And so that was the kind of motivation for that quote and line of work.
Are there some strategies or things that people can do that you recommend or that you've seen that are successful?
For promoting brain health in general, or
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I mean, I work at the Memory and Aging Center where we see a lot of people who have cognitive decline in later life or behavioral changes, and there are no great treatments for dementia yet. There's lots of work in progress, but right now we don't have great cures or treatments. So preventing, these changes is key. So often what we recommend are kind of the basic things such as good nutrition, exercise, very important, a lot of like good amount of sleep, but also to stay mentally and socially engaged. And so I think that's where emotions come in. It doesn't have to be a specific, app or game or puzzle or anything, but having a life that has meaning and purpose and using your brain to engage with others, challenge it in ways that you find enjoyable. Those are really, really key for keeping your brain healthy and active as you age.
I know we sent out a link where you were quoted in a couple of different articles about all walks, and I would love to just hear more about all walks and anything you want to share that that would be relevant for people in that area also.
Sure. Yeah, so we did a study on all walks. Really motivated by what I was just talking about with our Global Brain Health Institute, like trying to figure out simple ways to improve well-being and feelings of connectedness in older adults who are often at risk for loneliness and social isolation. And so what we did in that study was we recruited a bunch of older adults. They were on average about age 75. And all of the participants in the study were asked to go on a 15-minute weekly walk for 8 weeks. And so half of they were randomized. People didn't know what group they were in. We just put them, pick numbers out of a hat kind of thing. And half the group took a walk as I described. They were asked to go outside. They were asked to turn off their phone. But the other half were told the same thing. And in addition, they were told that we wanted them to try to experience awe. And what we told them what we meant by that, which was awe is, elicited in the presence of vast things. And when you're confronted with something you don't immediately understand. And we asked them to tap into their childlike sense of wonder, try to go somewhere new if they could. And they could go anywhere they wanted, cities, rural, suburban, whatever they wanted to do. And that was it. It was a very quick conversation. They left. We never saw them again. And I hoped the best to see what would happen. And then we did email them a lot. We emailed them every day and asked them to tell us about their emotions that day. We asked them to tell us if they'd taken a walk. And we asked them questions about how they felt on the walk. And we also asked them to send us selfies of themselves during their walks. So they sent us photographs. And what we were trying to see was, well, whether we could increase awe in the people who took the awe walks. But, that was the instruction, right? We told them, please, try to experience awe. So the fact that that group did experience more awe, which we did find, that was like a manipulation check, like our instructions had worked, check, we can make awe go up as they were good participants, they followed our instructions. But the key part of this study was really to see if there was kind of a spillover effect into other positive emotions. So we didn't want to just increase awe. We also wanted to know if like those pro-social positive emotions also increased in people who took the awe walk. So most of the analyses in the study kind of looked at people's like trajectories over time. So on the graphs, there's these two lines over time, and the groups were looking for this divergence of these two groups over time and how they were reporting their emotional experience. And so what we found was that indeed the people who took awe walks did feel more awe during their walks, and they also reported increased feelings of connectedness with others, and also increased feelings of being in the presence of something vast. We also looked to see if we had any evidence that they had the small self, as we talked about. So that was the other thing we were kind of wondering about. So we got all these selfies, as I mentioned, we had thousands of selfies, and we used the selfies for two things. First, we actually coded their faces to see whether we could quantify how intensely they were smiling in the photographs. So you can objectively assess how strong someone's smile is in a photo. And so, they told us they were feeling more positive in the awe walk group, but we wanted to see if we could find that in the face. And so first we quantified the smile intensity, and we did see that the people who took awe walks, again, over time, were showing bigger smiles than the people who took our control walks. The other thing we did was we traced the silhouette of the participant in each selfie. So, on my Zoom screen, I could trace my silhouette like that, and then I could compute the number of pixels in my face versus my background of my Zoom screen here. And if I fill my Zoom screen more, I would have a bigger score for myself. And if I like over here, more of my photograph would be filled with my background than my image. And so we quantified that, and we were wondering if the people who took all walks kind of filled less of their space, literally showed a smaller self in their photographs. And that is what we found over time. The people who took the all walks really did kind of shift down to the side so they could make room for the mountains and whatever beautiful place they were in their photographs. So that was kind of, to me, the most remarkable finding that we had. And then we looked at the other days when they weren't taking walks, just like to see when on a regular day during the study, if these effects persisted. And they did feel more of those pro-social positive emotions like compassion and admiration. Even on the days they weren't taking walks, they felt more connected to the world. They felt a smaller self, things like that. So it was like this enduring effect over time, despite not even taking a walk that day.
It's so fascinating. I mean, I think a couple things. One, I'm guessing it was an important component of the study to tell them to try and experience awe. And I guess, did you do that because you felt that they wouldn't sort of on their own without kind of getting that instruction, that they wouldn't necessarily do that?
Yeah, I mean, that we weren't trying to make that a secret, but
Yeah.
We wanted them to intentionally, yes, try to feel the emotion of awe. So we made it very clear that was the goal.
And I'm also really curious about like what the lasting effect is from awe. And this is just me, like, thinking about this, like, how long does that sensation last? How long do the health benefits that we're talking about last? Yeah, I'm really interested in that. I think we're getting close to time here. So if people want to start thinking about some questions for Dr. Sturm and post them in the chat, I have a few more that I'll continue to ask while people are thinking and hopefully posting some of their own questions and comments. The San Francisco Conservatory of Music and the UCSF Memory and Aging Center collaborate to explore the intersection of music, creativity, and brain science, which sounds incredible, really interesting. How does brain science relate to music? And can you just talk a little bit about the collaboration?
Yeah, it's a really fun collaboration, as you mentioned. So in some of the different conditions that we study in both older adults and in children, actually, there's really interesting patterns where when people have certain difficulties in certain areas of thinking or emotion, they might have enhancements in other areas. So one thing that we think a lot about is the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. And so the left hemisphere is very important for language and verbal information. The right hemisphere is very important for nonverbal information, including emotions, as well as kind of visual and spatial processing. And so Dr. Bruce Miller, who's the neurologist who is the director of the Memory and Aging Center here, has had a really long-standing interest in how in certain kinds of dementia, when symptoms affect language and speech, and the problems in the brain are primarily in the left hemisphere, sometimes these individuals can develop new talents in art and painting and nonverbal creative pursuits. And so it kind of illustrates this competition between the hemispheres, where if you have difficulty or weakness in one hemisphere, you might have accentuation of the other. We found actually a very similar set of findings in kids with dyslexia who struggle to read. So their brains are very healthy and working well, other than the fact that they have trouble with language and reading. And recently we found that those kids with dyslexia actually have more emotional reactivity to different kinds of cues. And so there's this, again, this left-right kind of imbalance that gives them strengths. And so music is one example of one of these nonverbal abilities that sometimes there's thinking that people who have dyslexia, for example, might be more likely to gravitate toward nonverbal pursuits such as music. And indeed, in that performance, there was a student at the conservatory with dyslexia who composed and performed a piece to kind of illustrate that point. So that was where that came from.
Wow. We do have a question here. Can we experience awe physically real in front of us, or can it be virtual, like dreamt or in the digital world? And are the effects on the body the same?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, dreaming and emotions, sure. I think we all have emotions while we dream. How that works, I don't know exactly, but definitely virtual, memory, anything again that kind of triggers that emotion generation system can produce awe. So I think if you were playing a video game or in some kind of virtual worlds where you felt like you were, on a mountaintop or seeing something, it might be the most powerful elicitor of awe because maybe it's an experience that we couldn't have here in our real lives. So yes, I think definitely you could elicit awe in either of those ways. And I think the effects would be the same in the body. If the emotion's the same, the effects in the body, I would suspect would be the same.
Can you talk a little bit about emotional reactivity, and how do you study emotional reactivity in older adults?
Yeah, so the term emotional reactivity has to do with the part of that process of emotion that I mentioned earlier. After appraisal, the emotion is produced, and the reactivity part is that emotion generation, emotion production. And so that's what we do a lot of our work on, is that part of the system. So to measure that, what we do is we usually bring people into a laboratory, which is the opposite of our AWOC study. This is a very controlled environment. It's a very simple room. We know what they're seeing. We know what they're hearing. In the AWOC study, I had no idea where they were or what they were seeing or hearing. So it's the opposite of experimental control in that way. But we usually show them things like movies or photographs, or do simple tasks with other people in that lab space when they are hooked up to a variety of different sensors. And so we measure things in the body such as heart rate, breathing, again, sweating on the hand, temperature on the hand. And so we can quantify like how much your heart rate goes up or it goes down while you're watching my awe-inducing video, for example. We also look very closely at the face, and we video record everybody during the task. And then later we can use these systems where you can quantify every movement in the muscles in the face at every second. So over time, we can see how your face is moving and also which muscles you're showing. So all of that is, those are considered objective measures of emotional reactivity. I can also ask you how you feel. We do that too. I ask you to describe it. I ask you to rate different words. That's a subjective component of the emotional reactivity kind of system.
You gave a terrific presentation on YouTube that talked about the relationship between poetry and science. You mentioned this great quote by William Wordsworth, which defined poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. It's just such a beautiful definition of poetry. And you talked about how poetry is where the left side of the brain, which focuses on language, which you just explained, and on the right side of the brain, which focuses on emotion, where poetry is in the middle, like shares both of those. And you studied, I guess, a deterioration of poetry, which correlated to a type of dementia, or I guess, was it a deterioration of an understanding of poetry or an ability to write poetry, which was called FTD? I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that research.
Yeah, I mean, that was a really fun event that we get to do here at UCSF and San Francisco, sometimes through LitQuake, and it brings together artists and scientists to talk about common topics of interest. And so, yeah, FTD is a degenerative disease of the brain that refers to frontotemporal dementia. And so that means that the frontal lobes and the temporal lobes, which are all in the anterior portion of the brain, decline over time and have dysfunction as the disease kind of affects the neurons in those parts of the brain. So in FTD, the main symptoms are not in things like memory, which we all associate with Alzheimer's disease, and that's a kind of, you know, well-known problem of aging where people can't remember day-to-day life, they get lost, they ultimately have trouble taking care of themselves. Frontotemporal dementia affects social behavior and emotion. So people lose empathy, they become apathetic, they don't engage with their family members, they don't do much of anything that they used to enjoy. They can become disinhibited and say things that they wouldn't have said before, inappropriate things, rude things, and they have difficulty with things like planning and paying attention. And so the parts of the brain that FTD affects are kind of what people refer to often as like the social brain. And so it has to do with also like understanding abstract, you know, concepts and thoughts. So in poetry, for example, it's like the epitome of lots of things that someone with FTD would have trouble with, understanding the abstract parts of the poem, but also feeling the states that poetry is supposed to elicit, because they have trouble producing emotions. The generation of emotions that I was talking about is definitely affected and declines in people with FTD, so they don't generate or feel much of anything as they did in the past. And so that was, I think, what we were talking about there.
I was reading another study that was talking about how I guess they were measuring a lack of curiosity as a potential marker for Alzheimer's. Do you think, and maybe this is already happening, I just don't know, but are these kinds of tests, do you think, going to complement, you know, other kinds of testing that people do to test memory or to forecast dementia or Alzheimer's?
I think so. I mean, I think there has been a narrow focus, to be honest, on certain cognitive abilities in Alzheimer's, but also even in FTD and other disorders. And our work generally focuses on the non-cognitive things such as emotion, but things like curiosity, or, you know, there are millions of other aspects of our day-to-day lives that can be affected if your brain isn't functioning in the exact way that it used to, that could also be markers of decline. Some of them are just hard to put your finger on, you know, so people don't know what it is, and therefore it's hard to measure. But also, I think there's a tendency to not appreciate those as being primary changes from a brain disorder. I think there's a tendency to say, well, the real problem is, you know, memory, but so of course she isn't curious or whatever. But I always like to say, like, why isn't the real problem curiosity and the other problem is memory, right? Like there's a bias, I think, that everything besides the cognitive part is some kind of psychological reaction to the cognitive problem. But I think we're seeing in Alzheimer's disease that actually some aspects of emotion and emotional empathy in particular, which has to do with how I respond to other people's emotions and feel others' emotions, actually goes up. It doesn't go down. It's people become more sensitive and more empathic in Alzheimer's disease. So that's the other side of the story. I think not everything goes down. You know, you don't lose everything. Sometimes you gain things, and gaining things is not always good, but it's more complicated than just loss as well.
So there's another question here. Is there a correlation between the number of awe moments that a person experiences throughout their life to longevity or to positive brain health, I guess, later in life?
Yeah, I don't know if we have the exact answer to that, but I think so, yes. I mean, I think all of these things are just, little drops in the bucket, but together the bucket matters, and we tried to get at that in our study a little bit, like looking to see if there was like a dose-like effect, because in like a medicine drug trial, you always want to know like if the people who took more of the medicine did better than the people who took less of the medicine. So we kind of looked at that too. And we did see an effect. We did see some evidence that the people who took more walks did have more benefit. And, this was only an 8-week study. And so, you kind of were asking whether these effects endured. And I don't know how long. But if you continued on with the practice of, seeking out awe in a walk or wherever it is, sitting at your computer, I think that yes, over time they accumulate and would improve mental and brain health more than if you had fewer of those experiences.
I think there's a lot of awe walkers in the humane space who would potentially volunteer for a longer study. I'm one of them, which would be fascinating. Just like I think just maybe two more questions. I'll see if there's any more in the chat, but do certain emotions prompt more outward reactions in the body? Meaning, like, are we better able to hide physical responses for certain emotions versus others?
I don't know. It's hard to compare emotions head to head in that way a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think people vary, in how well they can probably regulate different emotions, whether it's like a emotion specific fact of like disgust is harder to regulate than amusement or something. I don't know about that, but I do think that people definitely vary in their emotion regulation abilities and probably in which emotions they can regulate more than others, but it also probably really depends on like context and age and all of those factors, because, kids who can't stop giggling in a situation where they're like at a funeral or something, you know what I mean? Like that might be a specific thing that you grow out of. Maybe not, I don't know. But so yeah, we do know that like different ways of regulating emotions have different effects on the body. So, if you just like try to suppress your emotions by like showing nothing on your face, but inside you're really having a strong emotion, physiologically in your body, it's actually a bigger response. Like the body is like over responds because you're trying to like, shut it down. So if you want to change your emotions or reduce your emotions when you're not supposed to have them or you don't want to have them, it's better to, reappraise, think of it in a different way, change how you're interpreting or what you're focusing on in the situation. And then the emotion is actually less in the body. But if you're just clamping down, then that's probably where the, laughing in the funeral kind of situation happens.
That's really interesting. Looking forward, do you think having a greater understanding of an individual's right and left brain balance or imbalance will help us like better tailor how we learn, maybe especially for kids?
Yeah, I think that's one of the goals of the UCSF Dyslexia Center here is where we who we collaborate with to do our work on emotions and dyslexia. And it's really like a whole brain, whole child approach where the goal isn't just to identify problems and weaknesses, but also strengths. And as I mentioned, in all of us, we don't all have strong brain networks for every ability. Some of us are better at some things than others. And that's totally normal and part of the beauty of human ability across the world, that we all have different combinations of strong and weak networks. And so, in the educational system, it's very focused on reading and math and writing and those specific, sets of skills. And so all of the other skills are often underappreciated. Things like creative processing and art and the things we've talked about. So yeah, I think in the future, if we can all kind of understand that we all are this, have a different role in this giant mosaic, and diversity in the brain, that each person has ways that they can probably learn more easily, or areas that they can learn more easily and excel in than others, and it's all good.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. This was really fascinating. Oh, we have one more question here. How can emotions be delayed and or combined to be manifest subconsciously?
Delayed, let's see. Well, it's hard to, well, I'm thinking of this research on startle, which is not really, it's at the borderline between emotion and reaction. And there's been thought that you can't ever delay or modify a startle. So that's kind of an extreme example where someone would say, you can't delay that, because, you know, if someone like runs into your room or something and unexpectedly, it's very, very automatic to startle. And so part of me wonders if you can delay, like something like disgust. Can I delay disgust if something really disgusting was in front of me? I can do things very quickly to not have that reaction. You know, I walk to work. If I see something in my peripheral vision that I think is disgusting on the sidewalk, I don't look at it, you know, and that's a way of regulating and delaying or not feeling disgust that I don't want to have. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but I think the regulation of emotion happens very, very quickly, if not also automatically in some contexts, which can subvert or slow down or avoid or delay the emotion. That's, I guess, how I would think about that. And the other part, sorry,
Yeah, and or combined. So can emotions combine to be manifest subconsciously?
yeah, I mean, people talk about mixed emotions pretty frequently, you know, and it's easy to think of times where you felt like happy for someone, but also sad about, you know, losing them or whatever it is. And so there's definitely mixed states. And there's some evidence that those mixed, so one idea is that you could have two emotions at once. Like I could truly feel sad and happy or whatever at the exact same moment. The other idea is that if they are these little brief bursts that are only a few seconds, I might be kind of going back and forth between them. Maybe I have a little burst of sadness and then happiness and sadness and happiness. And together I kind of feel both, right? And with my words, I'm like, oh, I feel this mixed state. So I think, to me, I always think of like the language and how I would express or describe my emotions as another level above my physiology of my body and my brain and what is going on in the body. So those are two different ways of, you know, even when we use that word emotion, like what part do you mean? Do you mean both? And how do the systems interact? These are all ongoing questions of study. And I think same thing for like subconscious question, like what do you mean what do you mean by that? You know, like, do you mean they don't verbally say they feel something, or that they don't know that they feel something? And whether they know or don't know, that's a very hard question, right? Like all I can do is ask you, and what you tell me is that's as good as it gets, right? So if you say, like, sometimes we study people and, you know, I see their skin conductance, the sweating on their hands, like really high when I'm showing them some video. And then I say, you know, we ask them all these emotions. They're like, I felt nothing. They're like, okay, well, who is right? You know, like, did they not feel anything? Did they feel something they don't want to tell me? Or, you know, maybe the skin conductance, the sweating change it's not the emotion per se, it's just one part of the emotion. So maybe they had the skin conductance response, but subjectively they didn't equate that with a feeling state. I don't know, it's a hard question, but consciousness, I try to avoid consciousness in general because it's impossible to like really disentangle it. That's my best answer.
So Angela asked, do you believe finding awe is similar to practicing gratitude in terms of the wellness benefits?
Yeah, I think there's definitely similarities. I mean, I think all positive emotion interventions, such as journaling for, you know, promoting gratitude, for example, can definitely yield similar benefits. Gratitude is a little more complicated, I think, honestly, than awe. And there's a little more nuance in the social components, but each emotion kind of shifts you in different ways. So I think gratitude might, promote more of these interpersonal, well, depending on if you just feel it or you express it, I guess, but interpersonal kind of specific changes versus awe. I think it's a more collective just orientation to the world that might transcend. But yes, there's definitely commonalities, I think, in the two.
Well, I think talking about gratitude is a great way to close this conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Sturm, and it's been fascinating. I can't wait to follow what research you're working on now and in the future. And thanks so much to everyone for joining us tonight. Have an awe-inspired day tomorrow. Try and get out and see the world.
Thanks so much for having me.